Section 43 of John Inglesant, A Romance. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. John Inglesant, A Romance by Joseph Henry Shorthouse. Chapter 27, Part 1. The Duke had engaged the next morning to be present at a theatrical representation of a religious character, somewhat of the nature of a miracle play, to be given in the courtyard of the Hospital of Death, which adjoined to the Campo Santo of the city. Before accompanying his Highness, Inglesant had given orders to have the man who had been the cause of so much excitement the evening before brought into his apartment, that he might see whether or no his eccentricity made him sufficiently interesting to be presented to the Duke. When the stranger was brought to the palace early in the morning, and having been found to be quite harmless, was entrusted by the guard to two servants to be brought into Inglesant's presence, he thought himself in a new world. Hitherto his acquaintance with Italian life had been that of a stranger and from the outside. He was now to see somewhat of the interior life of a people among whom the glories of the Renaissance still lingered, and to see it in one of the most wonderful of the Renaissance works, the Ducal Palace of Umbria. Born in the dull twilight of the north, and having spent most of his mature years amongst the green mezzotints of Germany, he was now transplanted into a land of light and colour, dazzling to a stranger so brought up. Reared in the sternest discipline, he found himself among a people to whom life was a fine art, and the cultivation of the present and its enjoyments the end of existence. From room to room, as he followed his guide, who pointed out from time to time such of the beauties of the place as he considered most worthy of notice, the stranger saw around what certainly might have intoxicated a less composed and determined brain. The highest efforts of the genius of the Renaissance had been expended upon this magnificent house. The birth of a new instinct, differing in some respects from any instincts of art which had preceded it, produced in this and other similar efforts original and wonderful results. The old Greek art entered with unsurpassable intensity into sympathy with human life, but it was of necessity original and creative, looking always forward and not back, and lacked the pathos and depth of feeling that accompanied that new birth of art which sought much of its inspiration among the tombs and ruined grottos, and most of its sympathetic power among the old well-springs of human feeling, read in the torn and faded memorials of past suffering and destruction. This new instinct of art abandoned itself without reserve to the pursuit of everything which mankind had ever beheld of the beautiful, or had felt of the pathetic or the sad, or had dreamed of the noble or the ideal. The genius of the Renaissance set itself to reproduce this enchanted world of form and colour, traversed by thoughts and spiritual existences mysterious and beautiful, and the home of beings who had found this form and colour and these mysterious thoughts blend into a human life delicious in its very sorrows, grotesque and incongruous in its beauty, alluring and attractive amid all its griefs and hardships. So much so indeed that in the language of the old fables the gods themselves could not be restrained from throwing off their divine garments and wandering up and down among the paths and the adventures of men. By grotesque and humorous delineation, by fanciful representation of human passion under strange and unexpected form, by the dumb ass speaking and grasshoppers playing upon flutes, was this world of intelligent life reproduced in the rooms and on the walls of the house through which the stranger walked for the first time. He probably thought that he saw little of it, yet the bizarre effect was burning itself into his brain. From the overhanging chimney-pieces, antique masks and figures such as he had never seen, even in dreams, leered out upon him from arabesque carvings of foliage, or skulked behind trophies of war, of music, or of the arts of peace. The door and window frames seemed bowers of fruit and flowers, and forests of carved leaves wreathed the pilasters and walls. But this was not all. With a perfection of design and an extraordinary power of fancy, this world of sylvan imagery was peopled by figures and stories of exquisite grace and sweetness, representing the most touching incidents of human life and history. Men and women, lovers and warriors, in conflicts and dances and festivals, in sacrifices and games, children sporting among flowers, bereavement and death, husbandry and handicraft, hunters and beasts of chase, again among bryony and jasmine and roses, or perched upon ears of corn and sheaves of maize, birds of every plumage confronted, so the grotesque genius willed, fish, sea monsters, and shells and marine wonders of every kind. Upon the walls, relieved by panelling of wood, were paintings of landscapes and the ruined buildings of antiquity, overgrown with moss, or of modern active life in markets and theatres, of churches and cities in the course of erection, with the architects and scaffold poles, of the processions and marriages of princes, of the ruin of emperors and of kings. Below and beside these were credenzas and cabinets upon which luxury and art had lavished every costly device and material which the world conceived or yielded. Inlaid with precious woods and glittering with costly jewels and marbles, they reproduced in these differing materials all those infinite designs which the carved walls had already wearied themselves to express. Plaques and vases from Castel Durante or Faience, some of a strange pale colour, others brilliant with a grotesque combination of blue and yellow, crowded the shelves. Passing through this long succession of rooms, the stranger reached at last a library, a noble apartment of great size, furnished with books in brilliant antique binding of gold and white vellum, and otherwise ornamented with as much richness as the rest of the palace. Upon reading, desks were open, manuscripts and printed books richly illuminated. Connected with this apartment by open arches was an anteroom or corridor, which again opened on a loggia, beyond the shady arches of which lay the palace gardens, long vistas of green walks and reaches of blue sky, flecked and crossed by the spray of fountains. The decorations of the anteroom and loggia were more profuse and extravagant than any that the stranger had yet seen. There was a tradition that this portion of the palace had been finished last, and that when the workmen arrived at it, the time for the completion of the whole was very nearly run out. The attention of all the great artists hitherto engaged upon different parts of the entire palace was concentrated upon this unfinished portion, and all their workmen and assistants were called to labour upon it alone. The work went on by night and day, not ceasing even to allow of sleep. Unlimited supplies of Greek wine were furnished to the workmen, and stimulated by excitement and the love of art, emulating each other and half intoxicated by the delicious wine, the work exceeded all previous productions. For wild boldness and luxuriance of fancy, these rooms were probably unequalled in the world. In the anteroom facing the loggia, the stranger found Inglesant conversing with an Italian who held rather a singular post in the ducal court. He was standing before a cabinet of black oak, inlaid with representations of lutes and fifes, over which were strewn roses confined by coloured ribbons, and supporting vases of blue and yellow maiolica, thrown into strong relief by the black wood. Above this cabinet was a painting representing some battle in which a former duke had won great honour, while on a grassy knoll in the foreground the huntsmen of Ganymede were standing with their eyes turned upward towards the bird of Zeus, who is carrying the youth away to the skies, emblematical of the alleged apotheosis of the ducal hero. Richly dressed in a fantastic suit of striped silk, and leaning against the cabinet in an attitude of listless repose, Inglesant was contemplating an object which he held in his hand, and which both he and his companion appeared to regard with intense interest. This was an antique statuette of a fawn, holding its tail in its left hand, and turning its head and body to look at it, an occupation of which, if we may trust the monuments of antiquity, this singular creature appears to have been fond. The Italian was of a striking figure, and was dressed somewhat more gaily than was customary with his countrymen, and the whole group was fully in unison with the spirit of the place, and with the wealth of beauty and luxury of human life that pervaded the whole. The man who was standing by Inglesant's side, and who had the air of a connoisseur or virtuoso, was an Italian of some 50 years of age. His appearance, as has been said, was striking at first sight, but on longer acquaintance became very much more so. He was tall, and had been dark, but his hair and beard were plentifully streaked with gray. His features were large and aquiline, and his face deeply furrowed and lined. His appearance would have been painfully worn, almost to ghastliness, but for a mocking and humorous expression which laughed from his eyes, his mouth, his nostrils, and every line and feature of his face. Whenever this expression subsided, and his countenance sank into repose, a look of wan sadness and even terror took its place, and then large black eyes became fixed and intense in their gaze, as though some appalling object attracted their regard. This man had been born of a good but poor family, and had been educated by his relations with the expectation of his becoming an ecclesiastic, and he had even passed some time as a novice of some religious order. The tendency of his mind not leading him to the further pursuit of a religious life, he left his monastery, and addressed himself to live by his wits among the families and households of princes. He had made himself very useful in arranging comedies and pageantries, and he had at one time belonged to one of those dramatic companies called Zanni, who went about the country reciting and acting comedies. Combined with this talent, he discovered great aptitude in the management of serious affairs, and was more than once, while apparently engaged entirely on theatrical performances, employed in secret state negotiations which could not so well be entrusted to an acknowledged and conspicuous agent. In this manner of life he might have continued, but having become involved in one of the contests which disturbed Italy, he received a dangerous wound in the head, and on rising from his sick bed in the albergo in which he had been nursed, he was merely removed to another as a singular, if not dangerous, lunatic. The symptoms of his disease first manifested themselves in a very unpleasant familiarity with the secrets of those around him, and it was probably this feature of his complaint which led to his detention. As he improved in health, however, he ceased to indulge in any conversation which might give offence, but assuming a sedate and agreeable manner, he conversed with all who came to him, calling them, although strangers and such as he had never before seen, by their proper names, and talking to them pleasantly concerning their parents, relations, the coats of arms of their families, and such other harmless and agreeable matters. What brought him prominently into notice was the strangely prophetic spirit he manifested before or at the moment of the occurrence of more than one public event. He was taken from the hospital and examined by the Pope, and afterwards at several of the sovereign courts of Italy. Thus, not long before the time when Inglesant met him in the ducal palace at Umbria, he was at Chambéry, assisting at the preparation of some festivals which the young Duke of Savoy was engaged in celebrating. One day, as he was seated at dinner with several of the Duke's servants, he suddenly started up from his seat, exclaiming that he saw the Duke de Nemours fall dead from his horse, killed by a pistol shot. The Duke, who was uncle to the young monarch of Savoy, was then in France, where he was one of the leaders of the party of the Fronde. Before many days were passed, however, the news reached Chambéry of the fatal duel between this nobleman and the Duke of Beaufort, which occurred at the moment the Italian had thus announced it. These and other similar circumstances caused the man to be much talked of and sought after among the courts of Italy, where a belief in manifestations of the supernatural was scarcely less universal than in the previous age, when, according to an eye-witness, the Pope would decide no question, would take no journey, hold no sitting of the consistory, without first consulting the stars. Nay, very few cardinals would transact an affair of any kind, were it but to buy a load of wood, except after consultation duly held with some astrologer or wizard. The credit which the man gained and the benefits he derived from this reputation raised him many enemies, who did not scruple to assert that he was simply a clever knave who was not even his own dupe. Setting on one side, however, the revelations of the distant and the unknown made by him, which seemed inexplicable except by supposing him possessed of some unusual spiritual faculty, there was in the man an amount of knowledge of the world and of men of all classes and ranks, combined with much learning and a humorous wit, which made his company well worth having for his conversation alone. It was not then surprising that he should be found at this juncture at the court of Umbria, where the peculiar idiosyncrasies of the aged duke and the interest attached to the intrigue for the cession of the dukedom had assembled a strange and heterogeneous company, and towards which at the moment all men's eyes in Italy were turned. Yes, doubtless it is an antique, the Italian was saying, though in the last age many artists produced masks and figures so admirable as to be mistaken for antiques. Witness that mask which Monsieur Giorgio Vasari says he put in a chimney-piece of his house at Arezzo, which every one took to be an antique. I've seen such myself. This little fellow, however, I saw found in a vineyard near the Misericordia, a place which I take to have been at some time or other the scene of some terrible event, such as a conflict or struggle or massacre, for though now it is quiet and serene enough, with the sunlight and the rustling leaves and the splash of a fountain about which there is some good carving, I think of Fra Giovanni Agnolo. For all this I never walk there, but I feel the presence of fatal events, and a sense of dim figures engaged in conflict, and of faint and distant cries and groans. As he spoke these last words, his eye rested upon the strange figure of the man so hardly rescued from death the night before, and he stopped. His manner changed, and his eyes assumed that expression of intense expectation of which we have spoken before. The appearance of the stranger, and the contrast it presented to the objects around, was indeed such as to make him almost seem an inhabitant of another world, and one of those phantasms of past conflict of which the Italian had just spoken. His clothes, which had originally been of the plainest texture and most uncourtly make, were worn and ragged, and stained with damp and dirt. His form and features were gaunt and uncouth, and his gestures stiff and awkward, but with all this there was a certain steadiness and dignity about his manner, which threw an appearance of nobility over this rugged and unpleasing form. Contrasted with the dress and manner of the other men, he looked like some enthusiastic prophet standing in the house of mirth and luxury, and predicting ruin and woe. End of section 43.